So our webinar today is being recorded. Before we begin, here's a few just kind of webinar etiquette for today that we would like everyone to be mindful of as we move through the presentation. Please remain muted for the benefit of all participants. If you can, please turn off your video or your webcam if you don't need it. That helps with bandwidth and the webinar experience, both for you and everyone else. If you're having any kind of internet issues, it's also helpful for you to avoid other internet activity while you're on the webinar. We would really appreciate if you can communicate with us via the host, communicate with the host, myself and Lona Brewer, via the chat function in GoToMeeting. You'll see a little chat bubble in your controls, and that will allow you to send a question if you have one during the webinar. We'll be checking the chat comments routinely throughout the webinar. If that doesn't work for you and you must unmute yourself, please unmute yourself, and during one of the breaks, we'll recognize you and you can ask your question. Again, today's webinar will be recorded. Please be mindful in your chat comments as far as who you're chatting with, whether or not you're sending a chat to everyone or just an individual participant. So that's a few kind of webinar etiquette we would really appreciate that you could follow today as we move through the Volkswagen Beneficiary Mitigation Plan. The agenda for today: first, we're going to go through kind of funding purpose and scope. So go through some basics of the Volkswagen Settlement Trust Agreement and the purpose and scope of that. We'll then move into Kentucky's Beneficiary Mitigation Plan, what that looks like for Kentucky. We'll also be reviewing how Kentucky will be accessing the funding that is allocated to us through the trust agreement, and what that means to potential recipients of the trustees agreement and the settlement funding. We'll then move into looking at what are some issues moving forward as far as what you can do to prepare projects that may be included in our beneficiary mitigation plan. So again, I'm Kenya Stump, Executive Director of the Kentucky Office of Energy Policy. I'm going to kick this off, and then Lona Brewer in our office is our VW contact, and we'll be trading off speaking and presenting during today's webinar. So let's first start all the way back in the beginning with the Environmental Mitigation Trust. We refer to this as Appendix D of the settlement agreement. At the end of this presentation, we have an appendix which gives a link to the settlement agreement. Originally and still $2.7 billion nationwide to remediate excess NOx emissions from diesel vehicles. It is intended to fully mitigate excess NOx emissions from 2-liter and 3-liter diesel engines. That was the source and the purpose of the settlement agreement. These are the funds that have been provided to states to utilize to mitigate these excess NOx emissions. Kentucky's portion of the trust is a little over $20 million that we can use again to mitigate excess NOx emissions from diesel engines. We did receive legislative authorization to expend the funds during the 2020 legislative session, and that included the categories of projects that we will be funding. In a nutshell, this is what was approved in the 2020 session and is the basis of our beneficiary mitigation plan. We can see we have some funds set aside for administrative expenses, and we'll talk a little bit more what that entails for us as the beneficiary. And then the three categories we'll talk about today are eligible transit buses, and those are for government entities only, eligible school buses, and light-duty zero-emission vehicle supply equipment, government and non-government owned. We'll take each of these three categories and do a little bit deeper dive as far as what was in the legislative authorization and what also included in the settlement agreement that applies to these categories. Some important dates. The trust fund was effective October 2nd, 2017. That started a 10-year clock for us to expend the funds. We are currently in year 3 of a 10-year cycle. We must submit a beneficiary mitigation plan at least 30 days prior to requesting drawing down of the trust funds. The court designated Wilmington Trust as the national trustee for the Environmental Mitigation Trust, and Kentucky is officially listed as a beneficiary. One important note that everyone needs to think about as we move forward is that this is not a traditional grant program, but a trust agreement. We are working with Wilmington Trust, who is the national trustee, and we're bound by the terms and conditions in the trust agreement. And then we are also bound by the legislative authorization that was passed for our beneficiary mitigation plan. So we have two things we have to look at: the language in our authorization, and then also the settlement agreement and the trust agreement and our responsibility to Wilmington Trust. Our goals, similar to the trust agreement, our goals in Kentucky are to reduce overall NOx emissions in the state. We also want to do that by maximizing the potential beneficial impacts of eligible mitigation actions on air quality in areas that bear a disproportionate share of the air pollution burden. We'll get into a little bit more about what that means. Lona Brewer will go through how we're going to look at air quality in the context of projects that we select as eligible mitigation actions. We also would like to work with entities that have administrative and programmatic structures in place that allow them to leverage and implement diesel emissions reductions projects. And I think you'll see as we move forward, our work with the Kentucky Transportation Cabinet and the Kentucky Department of Education will allow us to leverage and implement projects with this VW funding. We'll take a quick chat break to see if there are any questions. I don't see any questions in the chat right now. The next section will transition over to Lona Brewer. So I will go ahead and mute myself, and then Lona will jump in and we'll transition into kind of getting into some of the details of our BMP.
As Kenya said, one of the things that we need to look at is air quality in areas that have in the past borne a disproportionate share of air quality issues. In Kentucky, we have several areas that are non-attainment for ozone right now. Those are in northern Kentucky, Boone, Campbell, and Kenton counties. And in the Louisville area, it is Jefferson, Bullitt, and Oldham counties. In the past, we have had additional non-attainment designations for both ozone and PM 2.5. The slide is fairly small, but I think you can see for ozone, it includes under maintenance, and these maintenance counties are those that have in the past been designated non-attainment, but since that time have come back into compliance. But those are Boyd, Christian, Davies, Edmondson, Fayette, Greenup, Hancock, Livingston, Marshall, and Scott counties for ozone. For PM 2.5, you'll see that the maintenance areas still include Boone, Boyd, Bullitt, Campbell, Jefferson, Kenton, and Lawrence counties in Kentucky. So we will be looking at those areas for any type of funding opportunities to take care of any ongoing issues with those NOx emissions, because NOx is a contributor, nitrogen oxides is a contributor to both ozone and PM 2.5 air pollutants. There are some really important definitions in the settlement agreement itself. Class 4 through 8 school buses, shuttle buses, or transit buses shall mean vehicles with a gross vehicle weight rating greater than 14,001 pounds used for transporting people. And then further in the settlement, school bus is defined as a class 4 through 8 bus sold or introduced into the interstate commerce for purposes that include carrying students to and from school or related events. Those buses may be type A through D. A really important definition, and we will be stressing this throughout this entire webinar. Any of you who have seen me through the Clean Fuels Coalition or other opportunities to speak on the Volkswagen settlement know that I spend a great deal of time on this definition, and that is scrapped. Scrapped will mean to render inoperable and available for recycle, and at a minimum, to specifically cut a 3-inch hole in the engine block for all engines. If any eligible vehicle will be replaced as part of an eligible project, scrap shall also include the disabling of the chassis by cutting the vehicle's frame rails completely in half. So you can see that we will be taking the vehicles that are being replaced totally out of the use stream. They will not be able to be used in the future. The last definition, zero emission vehicle, ZEV, shall mean a vehicle that produces no emissions from the onboard source of power, either an all electric or hydrogen fuel cell vehicle. There are funding stipulations. These funds are for diesel vehicle replacements only to mitigate excess NOx emissions. You cannot provide additional vehicles with these funds. Again, vehicles being replaced must be scrapped, and we go back to Appendix D2 of the consent decree defining scrap to mean, again, at a minimum, to specifically cut that 3-inch hole in the engine block and disabling the chassis by cutting the frame rails in half. There are 10 categories of eligible mitigation actions in Appendix D2 of the settlement. These were the only types of projects that states and territories had available to them. For most categories, an eligible project would replace a vehicle with a cleaner light vehicle, or repower an existing engine with a new clean diesel or alternative fueled engine, typically 2009 and older. However, repower was not an option that was authorized by the legislative language for this upcoming fiscal year, and eligible vehicle model years were modified for school buses as well. House Bill 352 of the 2020 legislative session provided funding specifically for school buses. $8,521,700 shall be used to reimburse local school districts for 50% of the purchase cost to replace up to 5 school buses per district currently in daily use, meeting the necessary criteria with a chassis year of 2001 or earlier. That means that even though the settlement agreement said 2009 and earlier, Kentucky's legislature has decreed that only those school buses 2001 and earlier will be replaced using this type of funding. That also means that we had to come up with a way to determine what buses in the state were being used on a daily basis that met that criteria. For that, we looked to KDE. KDE publishes a list of all school buses in the state currently being used, whether they are used for special purpose or whether they are used for daily usage. That will be the list that we will go back to as we're reviewing these funding applications. We will be looking at that list to determine if that bus that is being applied for met the criteria, whether it's 2001 and earlier, and whether it has been used on a daily basis or as a special purpose bus. We had to draw a line somewhere. That is the best information that is available to us for the 1920 time period. We are going to want to move very fast. We are working with KDE to come up with mechanisms to be able to push this funding out rapidly in order to get new school buses into the Commonwealth. And this was one of the avenues that we are taking. The legislation also says if the funds are not available to cover 50% of the purchase costs that districts have requested, 5 reimbursement by June 1st, 2021, that the reimbursement shall be prorated reduced, which means if we get more applications to replace buses than we have available funds for, that $8,521,000, that we will have to prorate what each school district will receive per bus. Eligible buses. In Appendix D2, eligible buses may be repowered with any new diesel or alternative or all-electric engine, or may be replaced with any new diesel or alternative fuel or all-electric vehicle, with the engine model year in which the eligible bus mitigation action occurs, or 1 engine model year prior. And those eligible buses must be scrapped. So if a school district applies for to replace a 2001 bus, they will need to be replacing that bus with a model year this year or 1 model year prior. And again, the buses that are being replaced have to be scrapped. Appendix D2 goes further, and for government-owned eligible buses, privately owned school buses under contract with the school district, we can draw funds in the amount of, you'll see that under number 1, up to 100% of the cost of a repower. We've already said you cannot repower an engine under this program in Kentucky. Up to 100% of the cost of a new diesel or alternative fueled vehicle. In Kentucky, it's not 100%. It is up to 50% of the cost of a school bus for up to 5 buses. Now, that 50% for the cost of the school buses up to 5 buses, in Kentucky, we know that that includes both diesel and propane buses. That 50% of the cost of the bus is not the full cost of a bus. It's not a bus with all the bells and whistles. It is going to be a bus, the basic bus. It's going to be the base model of the bus. On 3, it says up to 100% of the cost of a repower with a new all-electric engine. For us, it's going to be up to 50% of the cost for school buses, part of the beneficiary mitigation plan and legislative authority. Transit funding. Kenya, are there any questions in the chat box for school buses? We're going to go on with the 2020 legislative session. (2020) legislative session, House Bill 352 provides $8,521,700 to be transferred to the Office of Transportation Delivery to replace public transit buses meeting the necessary criteria. Priority shall be given to maximizing federal transit grants. That was language specifically from House Bill 352. Appendix D2, eligible buses include 2009 engine model year or older, class 4 through 8 school buses, shuttle buses, or transit buses. Eligible buses, you'll see that the words may be repowered with any diesel or alternative have been stricken, or may be replaced with any new diesel or alternate fueled or all-electric vehicle with the engine model year in which the eligible bus mitigation action occurs or one engine model year prior. Again, eligible buses must be scrapped. Those transit buses are under the same requirements as school buses are. Under Appendix D2, for government-owned eligible buses, they would have allowed up to 100% of the cost of a repower. Of course, Kentucky is not repowering those buses, and we are limiting the amount that can be provided of up to 80% of the cost of a transit bus. Again, to try to maximize the federal transit funding that is also available to replace these transit buses. We could have also replaced 100% of the cost of an all-electric vehicle, including the charging infrastructure associated with that vehicle, which can be pricey. But in Kentucky, we can only provide up to 80% of the cost of the transit buses, part of the beneficiary mitigation plan and Kentucky's legislature. Do we want to look at the chat box, Kenya? Okay, I'm going to keep going. The 2020 legislative session also provided funds for the light duty zero emission vehicle supply equipment funding. $3,056,700 shall be used for the purchase of light duty zero emission vehicle supply equipment meeting the necessary criteria. Recipients shall provide at least 50% of the matching funds per project. We have asked our legal to look at what matching funds allows for, and it does include in-kind contributions. Now, this is a change from the consent decree itself, because it would provide additional funding for various types of zero emission supply equipment. Appendix D2. Trust funds shall not be made available or used to purchase or rent real estate, other capital costs, etc. It cannot go for construction of buildings, parking facilities, or general maintenance. It has to be the supply equipment. That light duty supply equipment includes level 1, 2, or fast charging equipment for EV charging. And it has to be located in a public place, workplace, or multi-unit dwelling. And it is not considered consumer light duty electric vehicle supply equipment, which means it's not located at a private residential dwelling that is not a multi-unit dwelling. So while you could pay for having a charger installed at a multi-unit housing development apartment building, you couldn't in a private residence. And then there's also light-duty hydrogen fuel cell vehicle supply equipment, which includes hydrogen dispensing equipment capable of dispensing at least 70 megapixels located in a public place. And for that, funding is limited to 33% of the cost of light-duty hydrogen fuel cell supply equipment dispensing at least 250 kilograms per day, and 25% for equipment dispensing at 100 kilograms per day.
And then I'm going to look at the rest of them.
Appendix D2 further talks about the differences in the amount that could be covered. Again, in Kentucky, it's not 100% of the cost. To purchase, install, and maintain that equipment at a government-owned property is only 50%. It's not 80%. At a public non-government-owned property, it is only 50%. You'll see that the amount that was in Appendix D2 continues to go down. But again, in Kentucky, it's only 50% of the cost. Now, under the hydrogen fuel cell, while Kentucky's legislative mandate says 50%, you'll notice that we have to go back to Appendix D2, which limits the amount available to only 33% of the cost for hydrogen, or 25% for that lower dispensing level. So while our legislature says 50%, on the Appendix D2 limits that to 33 and 25%. So we have to follow what is in Appendix D2 for that category. House Bill 352 also provides $278,500 to be used for administrative costs associated with developing these projects and overseeing the projects. There is a lot that goes with documenting, pulling down the funds, documenting what we will be doing, making sure that information is available to the trustee, filing semi-annual reports on what the state is doing. One thing that we didn't touch on was when we did submit Kentucky's Beneficiary Mitigation Plan, that was done on June the 4th. So we will have access to the funds sometime early in July, pending the trustees' review. The administrative costs, I went over a few of those. We have to make sure that any projects that we're funding comply with the eligibility requirements in the trust agreement themselves. And again, according to Kentucky's legislature. We have to maintain and make publicly available all the documentation submitted in support of the funding requests and the beneficiary mitigation plan. So not only is that information available from the national trustee, you can actually go to their website to see what actions have been filed, what funds have been applied for, but we also have to do that in Kentucky as well. This is a very open and transparent trust. It was designed to make sure everyone knew how the funding was being used. As I said, there are semi-annual reporting requirements, and now that we have submitted our beneficiary mitigation plan, we are locked into that every 6-month reporting period. And Kenya, I still can't hear you. Now I could, briefly.
Who's speaking? David, I'm listening at Volkswagen deal, you know, where they're going to give us 50% of the purchase price on a bus. They have to be daily route buses. Number 37 and 52 qualify.
Okay, Kenya is obviously having some microphone issues right now. I'm sorry, but you're going to have to continue to listening to me for just a little while. The process for accessing Kentucky's VW trust allocation funding, I actually think Kenya is trying me today. I think that's what it is. She's trying to see if I can just keep talking. You'll see in the boxes going across the page, this is our process for getting funding and putting funding out into the state. Kentucky submits the beneficiary mitigation plan to the trustee 30 days prior to requesting the funds from the trust, which I said previously that was on June 4th. The beneficiary identifies specific projects consistent with the beneficiary mitigation plan for funding consideration. And that's the process that we are in now. We're beginning these talks with our partners throughout the state, trying to make sure that the projects that we're going to fund are consistent with that BMP. After that, the beneficiary submits requests for eligible mitigation action funding by filing the actual forms, and the forms are very lengthy. The information that we have to provide to the trustee is significant for each one of these. Once we have filed that request, within 60 days of the receipt of the request, the trustee will either approve, deny, or request modification or request further information. So once we submit an application to the trustee to draw funds for projects that we have funded in the state, then the trustee has 60 days to review those and make sure that they are in line with what the state has filed in the beneficiary mitigation plan. And then after that 60-day period, the trustee will begin the disbursement of the funds within 15 days. So basically, if we do a good job in submitting the information to the trustee, if we've dotted all of our I's, crossed all of our T's, have all the information there, from the day we submit until the day that we begin getting funding from the trust is 75 days. So timing will be critical for our office in funding these projects and then turning around and reimbursing those approved projects. Because one thing that does happen, if we go ahead and pull down funds, say we have application for the entire $8 million for school buses or $8 million for transit buses. Once we submit that request and pull those funds down, we will, that sets up a time frame of when we have to get the money out. If we draw interest on those funds, that interest has to turn around and go back to the national trustee for use in the future, but it would be very cumbersome to send money back to the trustee and then request that money back again. The beneficiary funding request requirements. Remember, I said that we had $278,000 for administrative costs. Well, these are just a handful of some of the items that we have to submit to the trustee in order to draw those funds. We have to certify that the funding request fits into the beneficiary mitigation plan. There's a detailed description on how that eligible mitigation action fits in line with community and air quality benefits. We have to estimate the NOx reductions anticipated as a result of the proposed eligible mitigation actions. For both school buses and transit buses, that's going to include when we do develop that application process, we're going to have to get information on each bus that is planned to be on what those NOx emissions are for that bus. So if you have a 2000 bus that you operate on a daily basis, we'll have to get that information. You will have to run diesel emissions quantifier, which we will make available to anyone who wants to apply for the funding, to estimate what those NOx emission reductions will be, because that is something that we have to provide back to the trustee before we can pull the funds down. We have to come up with a project management plan for each one of those eligible mitigation actions, the budget and expenditure and timeline. Contracting. We also have the final.
Oh, sorry.
Whoa, what happened? The final disposition of the trust funds themselves. Beneficiaries have up to 10 years to expend those allocations, as we said earlier. We had till October 1st, 2027. The national trustee at that time is required to file with the courts and with US EPA an accounting of all trust assets remaining that have not been expended or obligated. And at that point in time, beneficiaries may seek to supplement their original allocation by filing with the courts and delivering to the trustee information that we have spent at least 80% of the funding that we have available to us, and apply for any residual funding that may be left from other states or territories. And if there are any additional funds awarded, they will sunset at the end of 5 years after that award, and those funds will have been deemed to be donated to federal, to fund federal agency projects to reduce NOx emissions in the future.
Lona, can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Oh my goodness. It's been quite a technology day, so I'm going to give Lona a break. Lona is our primary contact with VW. She knows all the ins and outs. I'm going to go through some of the chat questions we've had, Lona, because I've been monitoring that while trying to do my audio. Some early questions. If I'm not in an air quality non-attainment area, am I still eligible to apply as a school district? And our answer to that is yes, you're still eligible to apply. We are just considering air quality issues when we look at how we're going to prioritize funding of applications. So even if you're not in a non-attainment or historical area that's had air quality issues, we will still, you're still eligible to apply for those projects. Also, if we are using KDE's inventory, if the buses, if you need to make corrections to that inventory, I would encourage you to contact KDE to work with that. We are looking at their inventory, as Lona said, to see which buses are eligible and considered in daily use. This recording, we've had a question about the PowerPoint slides and the recording. This recording will be made available on our website, and we can also make the PowerPoint slides available as well. What other questions did we get?
It looks like there was a question about KDE's list and whether it will be made available. And I believe Alyssa Hanley
Yes,
has sent a
Alyssa.
link.
Yeah, Alyssa provided the link to that list.
Daily mileage, what is the expectation of this? I really do not know what the expectation for this is. I'm assuming that some school districts that have a smaller pathway for their buses would not have as many miles as one that would be, oh, I don't know, in a rural part of Kentucky. I'm going to use Frankfort as an example. Frankfort Independent Schools would have probably a smaller number of miles per day or per year than a bus that's coming out into my area of the county, which is almost to the county line. So I think it will just depend on the buses themselves and what those bus routes are.
Lona, can you still hear me?
Yes.
So we did get a question. Jay said, are administrative costs going to be consumed by the EEC or other recipients? I responded, as EEC is the the agency designated by the governor to oversee the projects. The administrative expenses have been designated that EEC will use those as we're overseeing and working on contracts and applications. So those are designated for EEC, not for the recipients.
Correct.
Let me see. If you would like to know where you find out if you're in an area that qualifies under the air quality, we can, that's provided on our website. And we can also, it's in this presentation as well, that lists the counties that are in non-attainment and maintenance. So it's in the beginning of this presentation. As far as what we've done, current actions that we have done here at the Energy and Environment Cabinet, Lona's been updating our administrative and contact forms with the trustee. We have an obligation to notify appropriate federal agencies for the trust agreement. We're in the process of doing that. We are currently working with Kentucky Transportation Cabinet on establishing the process for transit bus funding and identifying those projects. And as I've mentioned and Lona mentioned, we have just begun working with KDE on establishing an application process for the school districts. For those questions relating to ZEV that have come in through the chat box, we are currently taking public comment on light-duty zero-emission vehicle supply equipment. That is on our website. That is going to establish a record for how we target this funding and establish the process. So if you have comments or if you have experience with ZEV supply equipment and you would like us to consider that information as we move forward with the ZEV supply equipment, we would encourage you to submit your public comment by July 10th to us. It is on our website. We will give you the link to that in the next slides. But that will allow us to establish the record and then also inform us as we move forward, given the variety of categories within ZEV, on how we want to target that funding for that specific category. I'm going to take this slide because Lona, as she said, she was able to pick up for me early on during the audio. Please submit comments by July 10th on light-duty zero-emission vehicle supply equipment. These are open comments. We welcome all comments, information, experience, suggestions, and also questions for us to consider as we move forward. For school districts, you can go ahead and begin identifying school buses for replacement. We're going to need those VIN numbers. Identify if you're in a non-attainment area, maintenance area, as we talked about earlier. We are going to be using the diesel emission quantifier, both for transit and school bus funding. And so we will need you to also become familiar with the diesel emission quantifier. And as you saw, we have to show NOx emissions reductions, and we'll be relying on the diesel emission quantifier and those calculations in the application process. Begin working on a budget and expenditure timeline and your school bus replacement project schedule. So for school districts, you can begin by working through this and start gathering the information in anticipation of an application that will be coming out from our agency through working with KDE on an application for school buses under VW. For transit agencies, if you haven't already notified Kentucky Transportation Cabinet that you have a project that you think would qualify for funding under VW, we would encourage you to do that. KYTC is currently putting together the list of projects for us to consider under the transit category. Next steps, when public comment ends for ZEV, we will be reviewing our public comments and identifying focus areas along with the process for funding of light-duty zero-emission vehicle supply equipment projects. It looks like, as Lona said, we'll be releasing the application process for Kentucky school districts sometime after August 1st. And we are currently working on reviewing transit projects submitted by KYTC for eligibility.
Tom's going to, they said we could examine our inventory list. Right now, it's the only one that's listed as daily routes. If you've got another, he said there's probably another one that's listed wrong, that's 2001 or older. You know, and he said that he can probably adjust the list to include one more. So
again, if you're not muted, please mute yourself. I think we heard someone talking about their inventory list.
They've got the list now. If you go in there and all five of them suddenly get changed, they're going to be like, look at their list, you know.
So Lona, if you can still hear me now, I can
Let me figure out another one. Whichever one, you know, is, I wouldn't do that.
Lona, I think you can still hear me. If you
can.
Yeah. So I think we were hearing a conversation. Someone's trying to figure out their inventory list and having a nice side conversation. So the joys of a virtual environment and all of us telecommuting. So we are at the end of our session. I will say we have additional information in the appendix here. We have a link to the Environmental Mitigation Trust Agreement for state beneficiaries. This is our guidebook, as it is a trust agreement. This, along with our legislative language, is the basis for informing how we're going to select projects moving forward. I'll check the chat box one more time just to see. Jay says, any idea on the timeline for ZEV supply equipment application? Jay, I will tell you this. Secretary Goodman in our office stated that she would like this funding moved out this next the fiscal year beginning July 1. So we are going to move as fast as we can. As soon as we get comments in on July 10th, we will review those comments, and then we'll meet with Secretary Goodman and start putting together an application process. So I would say, Jay, that it's going to be, applications should probably be, I'm going to be optimistic, late summer, early fall, and then we'll move those projects hopefully to be done by the end of June of 2021. So we're going to move as fast as we can, and that's been the direction. Secretary Goodman would like it moved out as fast as we can to get this money invested throughout the Commonwealth. Reimbursement does occur after delivery. And that is a question that we had. We have to confirm that the bus has been delivered, and then also the replacement, the bus that was being replaced has been scrapped before we can do reimbursement. I think that's it. Let me see. Any other chat questions?
Kenya, one other thing, would remind everyone to keep checking back on the VW website. Any information, any timelines, any developments will definitely be posted there. Any application processes or anything will be posted on our website.
We also have, Lona, a question. When will we have the application for school districts ready? I think you have an idea. We don't have a specific date, but we have an idea of what we're going to shoot for with the school district application.
We do. We've been working with KDE, and it should be in line, hopefully, if things keep progressing, where they would be able to apply and know if they're going to have partial funding for school bus replacement sometime before they would typically be ordering school buses at the end of the year or toward the end of the year. So definitely stay tuned.
Now's your last chance. If you have any questions, you can enter them into the chat box. If not, well, I'll wait a minute or two to see if we have any questions come in. Here's a question. Will we be able to apply, then back out later if the pro rata amount is really low? We can do 50% matching, but if that number drops significantly, we would not be able to fund that locally. Will we know the exact match prior to ordering?
I would say yes. You will know the exact amount prior to ordering. If we can move very fast on getting that application in place. Again, that pro rata language is from our legislative mandate. Looking at KDE's website on 2001 and earlier buses being used on a daily basis, there should be sufficient funds or close to sufficient funds based on that list for all school buses in the state. prior to that deadline, keeping in mind that school buses that have more than 5 buses can only apply for 50% funding for up to 5 buses. So a county that has 20 school buses that meet the criteria of 2001 and earlier can only apply for 50% match for 5 of those buses. If a school system has 2 buses, they can only apply for 50% of 2 school buses. So we think that the funding will be close for the amount, but until we actually run the solicitation, we won't know for sure. But school districts should be able to know in advance of actually applying for a bus or ordering a bus what their funding level will be per bus.
Also, someone asked for the website. I've put the VW website in the chat box and then brought it up on the screen for sharing. You can get to it by going to eec.ky.gov, and on the right-hand side, you'll see a link to information about the Volkswagen settlement. Let me see. Any other questions? For the school districts, I know you've got lots of questions. This has been great. We've had lots of questions today from the districts. We'll be working with KDE, and we will be rolling out another webinar as we get ready to roll out that application. We will be opening that up so that we can just do an educational session on the process for school districts. Once we get that application process hammered out with KDE, stay tuned and stay in contact with us, and we'll be publicizing that webinar before the application process begins, and we can address the school district questions separately. We'll also be working with KYTC on Transportation Cabinet on their application process for transit. And as we mentioned before, we're currently accepting comments on ZEV. So please send us your comments and information on ZEV supply equipment as far as what you would like to see in the state, whether it be DC fast charge, workplace charging, any other, or hydrogen. All of those different categories that Lona went through. We're going to need to establish a record on how we can move forward with that a little over $3 million for supply equipment, and how we're going to allocate that funding within those categories. So I encourage you to submit your comments. As far as I know, we haven't received any comments on ZEV yet, and you can find that. We have a designated right here, ky.vwsettlement@ky.gov is the email address for you to submit your comments on zero emission vehicle supply equipment. That's it for today. We appreciate your attention. Sorry for the audio issues. We've never had a webinar with this many registrants on before. I think we finally got it worked out. It is recorded. The PowerPoint will be made available on our website, and we will also make today's webinar recording available for all the participants and those who were unable to participate as well. Thank you. Everyone have a great day, and please feel free to contact myself or Lona Brewer with questions that you may have. You can find our contact information on our website, eec.ky.gov, click energy, and then you can find all of our staff listed there. And so we welcome your questions and comments, and we look forward to working with the school districts, transit agencies, and our partners on the ZEV supply equipment. We'll be in touch. Stay tuned. Thank you for your attention, and everyone have a great afternoon.